Today, we're diving into a really tough but incredibly important story coming out of Meghalaya. It's all about responsibility, tragedy, and what happens when the very systems that are supposed to protect us, well, when they seem to fail. Let's get right into it.
So it all kicked off with this one statement: parents are responsible for their children's safety. Now, when you first hear that, you might think, yeah, okay, that sounds like common sense. But context changes everything. And the context here takes that simple observation and turns it into something, honestly, just shocking.
That's right. This wasn't just some random comment. This was the official response from a deputy chief minister after children had tragically died. So instead of reassurance, instead of a promise to find answers, this was the message that a grieving community heard. It immediately makes you ask that huge question, right? Where does a parent's responsibility end and the state's duty begin?
And that question is really at the heart of what we're looking at today, because this is so much bigger than just one insensitive comment. It points to something deeper, a stepping away from one of the most fundamental jobs any government has. It's about a failure of duty.
This whole thing really comes down to this core idea: state duty. Think of it as the foundational promise a government makes to its people. It's not just about armies and borders. It's about making sure our neighborhoods are safe, that laws are enforced, and that every single citizen, especially a child, is protected from harm. It's pretty much the bedrock of the whole social contract.
Which brings us to the real gut punch of this story. What are the consequences when that promise feels like it's been broken? What happens when the people who are supposed to protect you instead point the finger right back at you, especially in your moment of greatest need?
And this is where the story takes a really critical turn. The government's response seemed to reveal a strategy that many people found deeply disturbing, shifting the blame away from the state and onto the victims themselves. Let's break down how this all played out. And right here, you can see these two completely opposing views laid out side by side. On the one hand, you have the official stance, which puts the burden squarely on families. But on the other, you have the public's response, a powerful reminder of that core idea we just talked about. The state has a fundamental duty to provide security. It's a massive clash over who is ultimately accountable.
So unsurprisingly, the reaction was swift and it was fierce. The officials' comments weren't just condemned for being insensitive to grieving families, they were called irresponsible. Critics argued that this felt like a deliberate attempt to dodge accountability for what they saw as clear, systemic failures in public safety and policing.
And this is where we really need to zoom out and look beyond that single comment and at the system itself. You see, the tragedy and the response that followed, they didn't just happen in a vacuum. They exposed some really deep cracks in the very infrastructure that's meant to keep kids safe.
So the question becomes, what exactly was broken? What did these awful incidents reveal about the state of policing and its ability to respond effectively when a child's life is actually on the line?
Well, the analysis points to a few major failures. First, a failure to follow the established rules, the standard operating procedures, or SOPs, for missing children. These are the critical first steps, the immediate alerts that were reportedly just not enforced. Second, a lack of proactive community policing to prevent crime from happening in the first place. And third, and this is a huge one, a complete breakdown of trust between the police and the communities they're there to serve. This loss of faith is so deep that now there are even calls to bring back local defense groups because people feel like they have nobody else to turn to.
So the conclusion from the source material is pretty stark. The very system that exists to protect the most vulnerable people in society was shown to be broken. It didn't do its job, and when it was called out, it failed to take any accountability. But, just highlighting failure isn't enough. The analysis also points to a path forward. So how can that trust be rebuilt? How can this system actually be fixed? It really boils down to three clear, actionable steps. First, accountability at the very top. That means demanding resignations from officials who shift blame. Second, fixing the process itself, making sure the rules for handling missing children cases aren't just suggestions, but are mandatory, transparent requirements. And third, and this is the big one, fundamental change. Supporting the calls for a reformed police force that is truly integrated with and accountable to the community it serves. And it's so important to understand that this is about way more than just changing some policies. This is about restoring that fundamental promise of the state's duty. It's about rebuilding trust brick by brick so that every citizen can actually feel like the government has their back, especially when they are at their most vulnerable. So we want to leave you with this thought. The events in Meghalaya really force all of us to consider a pretty sobering question.
When a government fails in its most basic duty, to protect its people, the cost is measured in more than just headlines or political fallout. It's measured in lives, in trust, and in the security we all depend on. So what really is the true price of that broken promise?